Welcome to our first Lightboard video, and this one's about optimizing your cloud costs, whether that's sort of in AWS or Azure, because kind of what a lot of people are guilty of is like, as an MSP, if you take sort of fairly atypical customer, they might have, two badly drawn physical servers on site, which could be running a bunch of VMs. So we could have things like SQL, IIS, even still to this day Exchange, and you've got to figure out a way to get all these things into the public cloud. And when it comes to controlling costs, this is kind of one of the very first things that you can do to make sure that you get it right, because otherwise if you don't do this bit right, you're going to waste a lot of money. So the first thing to consider is there's three types of ways of sort of moving stuff to the public cloud. You've got lift and shift. So we're just going to take everything here and we're going to move that into Azure, AWS, whatever it might be. Big downside of that is it's not super flexible, so we'll give it a 1-star for flexibility, and it tends to be very, very expensive. Then we've got 2, which is to refactor. And we'll go through these in a little bit more detail, but refactoring is taking your applications and converting them into PaaS. So things like Azure SQL, AWS RDS, whatever it might be in terms of technology. And that tends to be very complicated because you've got a lot of applications you might have to rewrite. Some vendors won't support PaaS, gets really difficult to manage quite quickly, but it tends to be the cheapest way to go. Now, that's from a monthly cost perspective, not necessarily at the development time perspective, so you have to factor that as well. Last but not least, you've got hybrid. So this is kind of a bit of the best of both, looking at putting some stuff into sort of platform as a service and doing perhaps a little bit of lift and shift to keep it simple. So kind of examples of things you can do. So for example, you might look at like your SQL and say, well, actually, could we put SQL into, say, RDS or Azure SQL? Now, obviously, some vendors might not support that. If the customer's got a bunch of SQL VMs that's costing them a fortune in licensing, maybe you could consolidate them to a single node or 2 nodes in HA. So there's lots of things you can do there. RDS, could you use Azure Web Apps? Could you consolidate all application servers down to less, for example? Exchange, I mean, you'd be surprised how many people still have Exchange to this day. Sometimes there are good reasons to have it. I'm struggling to find any as time goes by. But Office 365, of course, most of you will be familiar with that. Stick it in Office 365, nice and easy. So yeah, they're the kind of 3 mechanisms for getting data into the public cloud. One other thing that we've actually missed from that list is the file server. So if you've got a file server, can you look at either, if you can lift and shift, you can just move the file server into a single compute instance. Could you use like Amazon FW or FSX, I think it's called, which is effectively a Windows file server delivered as platform as a service? Or could you use Azure Files? There's lots of different ways that you can kind of optimize all of those resources to make that you get the best value for your money. So that's number 1. One of the most important, I would say, choosing the right design to make sure that your infrastructure, because if it's not built right, it's going to cost you a fortune. So that's the first thing to get right. Number 2, so this is right sizing your workload. So get the right size. So what we mean by this is some pretty simple stuff. So when you buy a EC2 or compute instance, you might be buying 8 gig of RAM and 4 CPU cores. Now, more often than not, if that was based on a lift and shift, just because you had a machine that had 8 gig of RAM, 4 CPU cores, chances are you're probably not using that. And what you want to look to do there is if, for example, this machine was only being utilized at this capacity, look at a smaller instance and get it the right size. Now, there are some tools you can use for that, such as the Azure Advisor, and that will recommend VM sizes that are more suitable to your workload. There is also the AWS Compute Optimizer that you can use. Again, that's going to optimize, or that's going to tell you I can't guarantee my handwriting's any good. That's going to tell you what you can do to save money. But when it comes to public cloud, you really want to be paying for exactly what you use rather than what you might use, otherwise you're going to be paying quite a bit more than you need to. Number 3, reserved instances. So, believe it or not, this can save you upwards of 70%. So this is basically committing to a piece of compute for a period of time. Now, obviously, to reserve something you need, it typically is going to be something that's steady state, it's going to always be powered on. And if that is the case, like you've got a database server that needs to remain on all the time, then definitely you want to be reserving that instance because it's going to make it way more cost effective for you. I mean, it's anything from sort of 30 to 70%. Most instances will see at least 50% cost saving. Obviously, on the smaller end of the spectrum, on the much smaller instances, you might not see quite as much, but it's definitely something that you want to check and make sure. If you're not using it, you should definitely look at using it. So next one is, again, seems pretty simple, but people miss it, and that's powering off workload overnight when it's not in use. So there's a couple of different ways of doing this. AWS and Azure have tools where you can automate the power off. So you could, for example, you could look at your CPU graph, and let's face it, most organizations, if this was 6 in the morning, we're going to see an increase in CPU usage, and then 7 p.m. at night, we're probably going to have little to nothing. Now, what you can do is you can basically say, actually, for this period here, power the VM off. This period here, power the VM off. And what that's going to give you, it's going to give you a massive saving because, of course, if this 730 hours and you power that off for weekends and evenings, you potentially could be looking at 50% of the price. Now, obviously, you might not want to do that with every single piece of workload that you've got, but it's got the potential to offer a massive or significant saving in your environment. Number 5, it's licensing benefits. So simple to overlook. So this includes things like Azure hybrid use rights. So if your customer has an appropriate software subscription with software assurance or the right type of licensing, you can actually use the hybrid licensing scheme to get your licensing costs vastly reduced. So that, again, this could save you 75-80% on some instance types based on having the hybrid use rights. Now, obviously, you need to have the right license in order to use it, but that's, again, it's an often overlooked area. The other thing is, and this is not specific to Azure, but obviously if you've got Office 365 and you've got OneDrive and SharePoint, you can look at how you can use those to offload storage and put less on your platform. Obviously, there's pros and cons to that in terms of, it might not be appropriate for your organization, but it's definitely worth looking at. Next one, billing and getting it right is really, really important. So 6, billing. So basically making sure that you do your audits. I'd probably recommend doing them at least quarterly. So basically auditing all of your customer spend, especially if you're transacting stuff through yourself, through your clients, or you're building solutions for them and then passing that on, because no matter how much you save, if you are not billing your customers properly or passing on at the right margin, you're already at a loss by not doing that. So it's really important to audit your bills. Okay, so next one. And typically, as a rule of thumb, everyone will know, if you've got compute, you're going to need bandwidth. And bandwidth costs, they can be roughly in the order of about 20% more than your compute costs. So if you spend £1,000 a month, you might spend £200 a month, possibly more, on your bandwidth charges. Now, one thing to think about is Express Route and Direct Connect. Route and Direct Connect. So what these are going to do, they're going to let you get a private connection into your cloud and actually use them to move traffic in and out of that environment, and that's going to help you keep your bandwidth costs down. Now, will it work at £1,000 a month and £200 a month of bandwidth charges? Maybe not. But on a bigger client, where perhaps bandwidth charges are more like £500, £300 a month, then yeah, it's definitely worth looking at Express Route or Direct Connect options to because potentially you can move that traffic over that more private connection and actually save yourself a significant amount. Plus, potentially it's got some resiliency benefits depending on how you architect your solution. The next one is storage tiers. Again, often overlooked. You want to make sure that anything you've got has got the right storage tier. If you've got disks attached to servers, you want to make sure that they're in the right storage tier. So, it's every cloud calls these different things, but it's SSD, HDD, it's LRS, ZRS storage. But basically, you've got make sure it's in the right tier for what you need. So look at the graphs, look at whether you need that amount of performance. Can you move it to a lower tier? If you've got data in S3, could you make use of things like infrequent access or cold storage? Because some of those, we can be talking about 1/4 of the price for your storage. Number 9 is remove what you don't need. Again, sounds pretty obvious, but the problem with public cloud is you can provision whatever you want, and if you don't have the right process, it's very easy to forget stuff that is left behind. So go through probably again quarterly and review what you've got and make sure that you're taking out any resources that are no longer in use, because you will pay for everything, and that one VM that could be 100, 200, 300 pound a month, it's just sat there that's not being used. Yeah, definitely you can try powering it off and then see if it's in use, and then remove it if it's not required anymore. And on this same subject, look for things like IP addresses, S3 buckets, snapshots, anything that's attached anywhere that is not being used. Again, you'd be surprised what you can find. So yeah, this concludes our cost optimization video on AWS, Azure, and pretty much any public cloud. The points are all very, very similar, but if you need any assistance in optimizing your environment, please get in touch. If you like today's video, please have a look through our YouTube channel, and don't forget to